At 8 a.m., as the bridge at Halen blew imperfectly and the forts of Liège still held, the German invasion was already losing tempo inside the most critical corridor of the western advance. What looked like the opening of a calculated 6-week offensive was, in reality, the first sign that the entire plan depended on narrow margins, constricted roads, and dangerously optimistic assumptions. Every lost hour compressed schedules, clogged marching columns, delayed heavy artillery, and forced brutal adaptation, as Belgian resistance turned bridges, farms, crossings, and fortress lines into operational fracture points with immediate strategic effect. How did months of German revisions, logistical weakness, and diplomatic choices drive the entire campaign into a bottleneck called Liège? And once that clock began breaking in Belgium, how much of the decisive outcome in France was already being shaped? To understand that moment, we need to go back before the first frontier was crossed. Early 20th century Europe hardened into rival alliance blocs, and planners expected any continental war to explode across multiple fronts, forcing rapid offensive schemes before full enemy mobilization could take effect. German strategy assumed simultaneous war against France in the west and Russia in the east, with the eastern threat expected to mobilize more slowly because of distance, infrastructure, and antiquated command structures. That estimate created a narrow 6-week window in which the bulk of the German army could strike west first, defeat France quickly, then redeploy by rail against the eastern front. The invasion design aimed to avoid the strongest French frontier fortifications by moving through the neutral Low Countries, then sweeping in a vast arc toward Paris before turning against French forces from the rear. The right wing of this offensive was meant to be overwhelmingly strong, because its marching distance was the widest, its timetable the most demanding, and its success the foundation of the whole campaign. Even before the war, the concept carried structural weaknesses, especially Germany's shortage of manpower relative to the plan's requirements and the enormous logistical burden of moving massed armies fast enough. By 1914, the operational design had already been narrowed, since the revised advance would avoid the Netherlands and funnel more of the invasion through Luxembourg and Belgium on tighter corridors. The attacking right wing was also reduced substantially, because troops were withheld for Alsace-Lorraine and East Prussia, where planners feared border losses and a faster-than-expected Russian mobilization. These revisions weakened the broad maneuver originally calculated to carry sufficient manpower at speed, making every road junction, bridge network, and fortress line in Belgium far more dangerous to the timetable. Diplomatic pressure briefly preceded the invasion, but Belgian neutrality was rejected in practice, and once the columns crossed the frontier, the conflict instantly widened into the continental war planners had feared. British intervention became far more likely once Belgian territory was violated, meaning the Western War would not remain a short bilateral campaign, even if early German advances gained deep ground. For the invasion to function smoothly, the route assigned to the leading Western armies required immediate control of the Meuse corridor, where the ring fortress of Liège dominated roads and rail access. The Belgian defenses there were not merely symbolic, because the city's forts and crossings sat astride the precise channel through which the first operational thrust needed to pass at once. Thus months of alliance tension, mobilization theory, route calculations, and revised German deployments forced both armies toward Liège, making the fortress belt the unavoidable first hinge of the Western campaign. German forces crossed into Belgium on August 4, launching the opening phase of the Western offensive and driving toward the fortress city, whose reduction was necessary for the planned advance. Liège stood as a ring fortress with 12 concrete forts positioned around the city, controlling approaches, crossings, and artillery arcs that could disrupt columns trying to maintain speed through the corridor. The attackers needed not only the city itself but also the surrender or silencing of the surrounding forts, because intact strongpoints could still command the route and delay heavy movement behind the vanguard. Early assault planning underestimated how stubbornly fixed defenses could hold against rapid field operations, especially when fort guns, concrete works, and restricted access points forced infantry into exposed approaches. Belgian resistance around the Meuse sector unfolded while the broader German armies were already attempting to press westward between the Giet River and Brussels, creating dangerous tension between operational speed and incomplete security. The invasion's road and rail geometry amplified the problem, because a bottleneck at Liège could ripple outward across marching schedules, artillery transfers, ammunition delivery, and the alignment of multiple armies behind it. Meanwhile, further east and north, reconnaissance screens and cavalry movements searched for openings toward Brussels, showing that the offensive depended on synchronized mobility across bridges, river lines, and urban choke points. At Halen and along the Giet approaches, the landscape itself favored defenders, with rivers, bridges, railway embankments, hollow roads, hills, and swampy alluvial ground shaping where advancing formations could deploy or charge. Belgian forward elements combined cavalry, cyclists, machine guns, mobile artillery, and bridge engineers, creating a mixed screening force whose mobility allowed rapid occupation of key crossings despite limited overall national strength. On the eve of Halen, Belgian forces identified that German cavalry and infantry were concentrating near the Giet crossings, signaling an attempt to force passage and and push rapidly toward Brussels. During the night before battle, Belgian tactical doctrine adapted sharply, as mounted troops were ordered to fight dismounted with carbines rather than commit to traditional cavalry charges under modern firepower. Defensive positions formed around the railway dam, the Liège farm, the bridge over the Geet, and dominating hills where artillery could observe open ground and strike concentrations entering Halen. Engineers prepared demolitions on the Key Bridge, while covering detachments remained forward near Halen to delay any crossing and buy time for the main Belgian body south of town. Reinforcements from deeper Belgian positions were ordered toward Halen, but distance and marching time meant the initial defense would have to absorb the first impact largely alone. Across the wider front, heavy siege artillery was also being brought against Liège, because the first infantry thrusts had not broken the fortress ring quickly enough for the operational schedule. Then dawn approached, bridges were primed, guns hidden, cavalry dismounted, and two linked struggles, one at Liège and one near Halen, waited for the first violent tests. The opening clash came when German forces attacked the Geet Bridge at Halen around 8 a.m., supported by artillery, quickly making the forward Belgian position impossible to hold. Belgian engineers detonated the bridge during withdrawal, but poor explosives only partially destroyed it, allowing the attackers to seize a crucial crossing far more intact than the defense intended. Encouraged by that success, German cavalry entered Halen in strength while additional troops crossed on a pontoon bridge near Donk, preparing flank pressure against Belgian positions behind the railway embankment. Initial assaults on the station sector and railway dam were checked by Belgian rifle and machine gun fire, but mounting infantry pressure forced the defenders to fall back through exposed fields. At that moment, Belgian artillery revealed itself from concealed positions on the heights, striking dense concentrations inside Halen, and turning the town center into a zone of panic and disruption. Believing one hill to be the firing source, German mounted units launched a charge along the Steenweg towards Zelt, where hedges, barbed wire, and a barricade trapped them in a murderous frontal approach. Many attackers fell before reaching the obstacle, and the failed charge demonstrated how terrain restrictions and prepared fire corridors could annihilate cavalry momentum long before sabers or lances mattered. Further mounted formations then crossed the railway dam and drove toward the Mettenberg sector, hitting Belgian cyclists who were still retreating across open ground near the deep hollow road. Ordered back into the sunken lane, the cyclists used the depression as improvised cover, while the hollow road itself disrupted charging horses and turned momentum into confusion under rifle and machine gun fire. Over the next 2 hours, successive German dragoon, cuirassier, and Uhlan formations arrived in the same order they had crossed the river, repeating mounted assaults with lance and saber. Belgian cyclists, caught between the Betzerbahn and the Liège farm with little protection, resisted fiercely, helped by the hollow road ahead and by artillery shells that kept breaking up mounted formations. Even so, the cumulative weight of repeated attacks overran forward Belgian positions, and the pressure around the Liège farm intensified as German infantry and artillery joined the struggle from new positions. Rifle and machine gun fire eventually stopped the cavalry from reaching the guns on the heights, yet the Belgian line was steadily losing ground as the farm changed hands under concentrated pressure. Between 2 and 3 p.m. reinforcements finally arrived after a hard march from Tienen, deploying artillery on the Molenberg and in Lochsbergen, while machine gun sections opened fire immediately. Additional support from Diest struck German artillery near the road to Halen, easing pressure on the Belgian center and complicating further attempts to consolidate the captured ground around the farm. Around 7 p.m. the Liège farm was recaptured, restoring a central defensive anchor and allowing the Belgians to attempt a broader push intended to drive the attackers back across the Geet. That evening counterattack toward Velpen and Halen failed, because inexperienced infantry advanced into house-to-house machine gun fire and suffered heavily before securing decisive local gains. As darkness approached, the attackers measured the day's results against the cost, seeing limited territorial gain, rising losses in men and horses, and fresh Belgian reinforcements extending the defense. At Liège, meanwhile, the operational answer to stalled infantry assaults had already arrived in the form of 420mm heavy howitzers, weapons powerful enough to pulverize concrete forts one by one. These siege guns transformed the battle from contested breakthrough into systematic demolition, as fort after fort succumbed under industrial-scale bombardment once the heavy artillery was fully in action. Yet the crucial damage had already been done to the schedule, because the fortress ring held stubbornly until August 16th, long enough to complicate movement and expose the invasion to cumulative delay. By dusk at Halen the Germans withdrew, and by mid-August at Liège the forts finally collapsed, but the invading offensive had lost irreplaceable time at the very start. When the smoke cleared around Halen, the battlefield was littered with dead horses, abandoned equipment, shattered farms, and hurried graves spread across fields, roads, and village edges. Casualties and destruction were severe, with dozens killed and wounded at Halen, hundreds of horses left dead, and costly delays at Liège imposed before the Meuse route was fully opened. The Belgian success at Halen remained small in scale, yet it proved that aggressive mounted warfare could be broken by machine guns, rifles, artillery, wire, and disciplined use of terrain. Liège showed the opposite side of modern war, where immense siege artillery could destroy permanent fortifications once brought into position, revealing the terrifying industrial power now entering European battlefields. Together, these august battles exposed a lethal transition, with 19th-century mobility doctrines colliding against 20th-century firepower, engineering limits, and the logistical fragility of gigantic operational timetables. The invasion still advanced deeply into Belgium and France, yet the opening delays helped buy time for opposing armies to regroup, shift formations, and prepare the resistance that emerged later on the Marne. As the offensive moved onward, further diversions, resistance, and command changes compounded the damage, until the sweeping arrows of the original Western knockout plan dissolved into improvised multidirectional fighting. The halt and reversal that followed in September ended hopes of a short Western campaign, and the front eventually hardened into opposing trench systems stretching across a devastated landscape. What began with crossings, forts, cavalry screens, and siege guns in Belgium therefore shaped the entire war, because the failed timetable converted strategic ambition into years of entrenched attrition. In that sense, the war machine that pulverized Liège did win the forts, but Belgium's resistance shattered the clock, and once the clock broke, the short war died with it.